My name is Mark Lee. I'm a member of the Wheelwright Prize jury. I'm joined by my fellow jury members today and Germane Barnes to today's event titled Conversation with Germane. So welcome those all of you who are here, all those who are joining online. I'd like to start with a couple of announcements. GSD is located on the ancestral land of the Massachusetts tribe, which we respect and honor. A reminder that we have live captioning today. For the audience, those who are joining virtually, you just click the closed captioning icon at the bottom of the live stream window. And for those in person, there should be a QR code up there that you can click on the screen. I also want to invite you all to join us for a few upcoming GSD public programs. For tomorrow and Thursday, we'll celebrate the release of the book Democracy in Urban Form that features a series of lectures delivered by Richard Sennett in 1981 at the GSD. So first of all, tomorrow, Wednesday, Michael Sandel will give a lecture based on his book Democracy's Discontent. Then on Thursday, there will be a symposium with Richard Sennett, Diane Davis, Claire Zimmerman, Marcus Meeson, and Miguel Robes-Duran, who will reflect on the state of democracy and its relationship to architecture and cities. So today, I would first like to introduce our jury member for the Wheelwright Prize that convened a couple of years ago. First is, your far left is David Brown. David is an architecture professor at UIC in Chicago. His project is titled The Available City, that examines the potential of Chicago's city-owned vacant lots as a community-driven collective system and design. This project was the theme when David was served as the artistic director of the Chicago Architecture Biennial in 2021, which is now a nonprofit organization. Next to David is Megan Penzano. Megan, all our students know her. She has been on our GSD faculty for more than 12 years. And she's the program director of the Harvard Undergraduate Architectural Studies track, along with GSD's public summer design programs. Megan has coordinated and taught design studios and courses on representation and design education, and her independent practice, Studio PM, won many awards and work across different scales. I'm going to skip Germane. There are too many introductions already of him. David Hart, next to Germane, is a conceptual artist and an associate professor in the Department of Fine Arts at the UPenn. His work explores how historical ideas and ideals that persist or transform over time. Recent solo exhibitions include the Histories at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, as well as the Colored Garden at the Glass House in Connecticut. He, as well as a few others, had been in the group exhibition Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America at MoMA in New York, and he's been a friend and collaborator for years. Next to David is Sumaya Valley, who lectured here not long ago. She's the founder of a practice Counterspace in London and holds an honorary professorship at the Bartlett. Sumaya's work articulates the identities and landscapes of African and Islamic contexts. She was the youngest architect ever commissioned to design the Serpentine Pavilion in London in 2021, and was the artistic director of the inaugural Islamic Arts Biennale in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia in 2023, which marked a pivotal moment in the definition of Islamic art. In case there were some that didn't come to the lecture or watch it online, Germane Barnes is the principal of Studio Barnes, also part of a collective B-ARN-S, and associate professor and director of the Master of Architecture graduate program at the University of Miami School of Architecture, and the winner of the Wheelwright Prize, and that's why the reason we are here. So, yay, congratulations. So, it's been a couple years, since this group deliberated. What do we do as a jury? We judge, and then we came with a verdict, and Germane has completed his travels and showed his findings and his thoughts last night at the lecture. So to engage in a conversation, I think each of our jury members have prepared a question for Germane as a point of departure to start off this conversation or discussion. Perhaps we also have time to reflect upon as a response to last night's lecture. We can also share any regrets, for selecting Germane. So today's structure, we'll have a conversation, and then Germane also has a surprise for all of us. He has a question or a series of questions at the end, and then based on time, I'll open up the questions to the audience. So on that note, maybe I can invite Sumaya to start off her first either reflection or question for Germane.
Thank you so much. It was so incredible to be working with this team, as Dean Sarah said last night, reflecting on Germane's work. And I think a big part of what is so inspiring about the Wheelwright Prize is it's really an opportunity for us to think about where we want the future of architectural practice to go, how we see that being defined, and how this prize can contribute to the way that a practitioner is working to create that definition. So I wanted to ask you, Germane, to start. Your work, as we saw last night, really does blur disciplines in the most incredible ways. I think the way that you move through working between sound and sculpture and architecture is really quite extraordinary. And I think a big part of what our generation has to do is also think about what the future of an architect or the architectural discipline is, given that it seems, or we believe, I don't know if it's true, that we've moved beyond the generation of the singular starchitect as we know it. So I wanted to ask you how you see yourself in that role, and also how you define the word architect or architecture.
Okay, if we're going to start with the tough questions. First, I want to say thank you to the jury for selecting me. I know that Mark didn't introduce himself, because if you look that cool with glasses like that inside, you don't really have to introduce yourself. But Sumaya, to answer your question, I like to see myself, well, one, I don't call myself an architect. I call myself a designer or an architectural anthropologist. And I typically use that instead, because I typically feel like architecture is the keeper of stories, as a great opportunity to tell stories, or when we create spaces that people can then perform their own communal rituals, that's the thing I'm most excited about. So I think the way that I like to practice is a way of facilitating interaction. And that's less about tectonics, that's less about building, and that's actually more about community. And I think that's why I'm always so quick to share the credit with others that are part of the process, because that continues to expand my community.
I think that's really, really interesting to hear. And by the same token, I think that the contribution that you're going to make to architecture is also immense. I always insist on the title of architect, I guess, in contrast to you. In fact, recently I wrote something very small in a magazine, and they didn't have a bio or anything. They just had one line that said, "Valley is an architect." And one of my friends sent it to me and said, "Finally, somebody called you an architect." Because people always call me something interdisciplinary and artistic director, curator, whatever it is. But I think that all of those things also, for me, in my practice, are thinking about how they can make a contribution to architecture. And in your case, it might not be something that is intentional, but I think even as we heard last night from so many sentiments from the students, it is making a really big impact, and your position is going to change the way that the generation coming after us and this generation is seeing architecture and what's possible. And maybe as a follow-up question, and thinking about what you just said now, when you showed us the column with the hair, I was reminded of a conversation that I had with the architect Yasmin Lari from Pakistan, who was talking about making these chula stoves for women in Pakistan. And at the time, we were working on a project together in Makli in Sindh, and she just when we were talking about the materiality of how women are making these stoves, she said that a big part of the way that she thought about teaching them how to make the stove for themselves, or that piece of architecture for themselves, is that she likened it to their knowledge of making dough and the skills that they have in the kitchen. So she said that she taught them about the suppleness of mud, and how to mix with their hands in ways that they were familiar with. And that was not a kind of architect's top-down kind of condescending imposition, but really she said that the ways that they responded, because of the know-hows that they have, pushed forward the technique of building. So really thinking about this idea that these other forms of knowledge are incredibly generative and have so much to offer to architecture, not just in aesthetic realms, but in terms of knowledge systems and knowledge forms, in terms of perhaps the algorithms embedded in hair making. And I wanted to ask you about those leaps and jumps. I also have a research practice, and I think it takes a big leap of faith to move from research to form. And I wanted to ask you to reflect on that.
Yeah, so the identity column was the most difficult column to actually design. The labor column, I probably knocked that out in like 2 or 3 days. That one was actually pretty easy. Migration was pretty easy as well. I think the identity column was so complex because Black identity is so complex, and it was so hard to try to put all of what we are into one singular form. So I knew I wanted to be, I knew it was inspired by hair, especially considering hair is so important in the Black community, whether that is the absence of hair or tons of hair and how people might police that in the public sphere. And so trying to render that as an object was extremely difficult. And then when I finally finished it, and it had its inconsistencies and had its odd shape, I sort of became self-conscious about it, because in my mind, like, if this is a representation of Black identity, I don't want people to dislike it. Because I was worried on a big stage like the Venice Biennale that the reception might be, oh my God, what is this ugly thing? And to me, that wouldn't just be a reflection of the object, it would be a reflection of how people interpret Blackness. So then, when I got the opportunity to have it made out of hair, I was like, well, at this point, I don't really care how people receive it, because this is what it came from, and I think this is going to be spectacular regardless of how it finishes. And so that translation of sketch, well, idea to sketch, to then robust marble form, to then actually work backwards and retroactively make it out of hair, that process was super complex, because how do I explain to a hair braider, an artist, hey, do you see all these intricacies within the form? Do you see all these striations? You see all of these manipulations? Can you do that with braids and Bantu knots and underhead and overhand and extensions? And there's so many different hairstyles embedded in it. But she was just so incredible that Shaniqua was like, no, I think I can figure this out. I think I can make this happen. And she exceeded all expectations I had for the physical form of the object itself, to where I think that's probably the best execution that I've ever seen of my work, where it went from idea into the final version of it, to where even I was surprised by how it came out in the end, which I think those are always the best ways to feel as a designer, when you're like, okay, even I didn't think it was going to be this good. It was just in my head in that way.
I mean, just a quick follow-up on Sumaya's earlier question. Yesterday, during the question and answer session, you talked about the difference between trauma and joy, as a source of creation. And I'm curious of this notion of the Black identity for you. Is it always a positive or pressure, or at one point do you feel the pressure of representing a larger community that somehow also held you back in terms of your creative process? So because you always think whatever you do, you are in somehow of a spotlight, and you carry this Black identity behind you.
So I don't. The best way I can put this is, I sit in a position of extreme privilege. There are a lot of my ancestors who are not here, a lot of my friends, they're from the same neighborhood of me, that unfortunately are not here, whether that's drug overdoses or on violence, things of that nature. So for me, the reason why I don't design from a place of trauma is because I've seen enough of it that I don't want to see it even more when I make it. For me, is how can I counter this? How can I work from a place of abundance as opposed to a space of scarcity? And I am absolutely aware of the weight that I carry on my shoulders, because I am a descendant of slavery, because I am a descendant of freedom fighters and civil rights activists that have done so much to get me to this point. And that's why I say I recognize the privilege I have. That actually, I wear that with pride. Like, I have no problem saying, I'll do my part to continue this legacy forward in the States. Like, to me, that's not something that holds me back. It's something that actually empowers me. And it's something that I think has allowed me to be so successful, because it's not just me doing the work. It's my family doing the work. It's me utilizing all the ancestral knowledge and the oral histories I've gotten from my mom, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, who I was fortunate enough to see while I was a child, and then turn that into spatial praxis. So I actually kind of love that about it, and I don't look at it as a detriment. I can't speak for other people, because some people don't want that weight. Some people want to be able to say, I'm just a designer, I can detach myself from my identity. That's just not the way that I operate. Because if you see me, you're gonna see a black man. So I'm fine with that, and I'm gonna wear that as a badge of honor as opposed to some sort of hindrance.
Thank you. I was wondering if maybe David Brown could start off with the next question.
Yeah, in some ways it's maybe kind of follow-up and continuation, and to jump back, and it's more to connect the dots in terms of we as the jury were also seeing we were seeing the prior work that was kind of the basis for being able to project about the work. But to me, I think to talk about the head who wears the crown chairs in relationship to the columns. But I think particularly the identity column, since it does begin to talk about hair, and the chairs also begin to talk about hair. And so I think, but also to me that the one is a kind of, well, just if you want to respond to the just kind of initial prompt, the dynamics of those two and what you were just talking about.
So for those of you who don't know, when you apply for the Wheelwright, they ask for work samples. And so I was projecting, I was going to do work on columns, but like, I've never done anything on columns, but I do got these really cool chairs I designed. So hopefully they'll see a connection between these chairs and these columns. And if they don't, I'm screwed. So it's kind of how it goes. But the chairs were a happy accident. The chairs only happened because of COVID. So I was asked to design seating for an exhibition that I was designer of. And I wanted to do a very large inflatable that people could all sit on, because I was just fascinated by inflatables at the time. Okay. And then COVID happened. And the curator said, we can't have people within 6 feet of each other. You now have to make singular chairs for people to sit on. You got to get rid of the inflatable. So I made the chairs so that people could actually sit in them. Brought the chairs to the exhibition, and the curator said, who did these? I was like, oh, these are your chairs. You asked me to design chairs, here's the chairs. She's like, oh no, we're not sitting in these. I was like, so what the hell did you make me make them for? Like, you just made me spend the last 2 months designing and making these chairs, and you're not gonna sit in them? She's like, oh no, they're really beautiful. They're gonna be in the show. These are not being sat in at all. And I was like, but that was the point. The point was to have a person sit as if they're in a throne. Like, I always think back to that Huey P. Newton image of him in the wicker chair. And then if your parents are from an era in the 80s and 90s, they probably have a picture as well. And I have this really cool picture of my dad sitting just like I'm sitting right now in the wicker chair with his hands like this. Okay. And there's like a gold chain with gold earrings, like gold rings. It was like my favorite picture of my dad. So as I mentioned yesterday, a lot of my work comes from that sort of influence. And so those chairs were like me feeling like everybody should feel like my dad felt in that moment. And so the column stuff was also me trying to say, all right, how can I also make people feel like they see themselves in this? Right. The same way that they saw themselves in the chairs.
And to me, I think that what's interesting is the chairs in some respects are an expandable set. Like you identified, you made 6?
No, 13.
Oh,
it's just 13? They only had enough money for 6, so only 6 got made, but there was 13 total.
But so in a way, there are 13 crown types
that
you identified that are also related to hair types. And so I think that idea that you could begin to find something that's maybe small in scale in terms of combs, but begin to find a commonality with another object, expand it, and begin to present this other opportunity where actually an individual could be selective across 13 about which one best represents them or how they are feeling. So I think it goes to this aspect of uplift and joy. I think, to me, similarly, I think the columns, in some ways, they're an expandable set. But to me, I think there is what you're talking about a little bit, the the potential of the columns as less in order and more of, to me, it's interesting that you've also linked them all to ideas about flow. And so how they are able to have different types of identities and qualities through their potential repetition as well. So I think the identity column in marble compared to the identity column in stone or in hair is that kind of contrast in terms of what are the opportunities or the ways in which you get different forms of kind of celebration through even just those qualities of how they're made. I think is kind of what's interesting to me about the columns as this kind of other means of working compared to the chairs. But also that the connections are through the porch, and I see the connections through the idea of joy again.
So the other thing about the chairs and I'll jump back into the other part, is the chairs also were inspired by the shotgun home. So that's where some of the porch stuff came in, because the materials of the chair mimic the materials of typical architecture at that time. So it was steel frame, it was wood, and sort of you connect the rest as you can. But also being in Miami and seeing the diaspora and seeing Carnival and the sort of regalia that's super colorful that people would wear, that's where some of the ornament of all of the chairs came from as well. So that really was a celebration of joy. So if you push that to the columns, part of my idea was that they could be rendered out of different types of materials. So I'll tell you all this. One of the original ideas for the migration column and the labor column was for this show to make them all out of hair. It wasn't just going to be the identity column. And that's because if we think about water and we think about migration, I always think about when I was in high school and I just wanted waves. And so I just had a brush glued to my hand all the time, just brushing my hair. I was that kid in high school. You're laughing, David, because I was that kid. I will have 360s. It's gonna happen, right? And that was just a thing. So that was gonna be hair in that way. Then the identity column was gonna be out of braids and things of that nature. And then the labor column was just gonna be just straight up Afro, in a way of how do we deal with that as a texture. You laughing is the truth. And then I was like, nah, I probably shouldn't do this. I was like, because part of me is like, I love the fact that I'm black, but also know sometimes people get scared of the fact that you may be black, and it's like, all right, what is the line where people get terrified of the thing when they walk into the gallery and they're like, I don't quite understand it. And I'm okay with that, but I want people to also feel comfortable in the space. And when I say people, I mean people who come from that community. I'm not really concerned with people who are not from that community, but I feel like if you are from the community, you should feel comfortable in the space of seeing your own representation. And there's so many people that don't see 2C and 3C and 4C hair celebrated. So I wanted to see how can I find a way to manifest that in the forms themselves. But in the end, I went with the clay and the wood and the hair to keep it separate. But that was one of the early iterations of thinking through, because some of this stuff so many things were just overlapping each other, that when I was talking about the waves, I was thinking about the Murray's hair grease and how that might find a way into the show as well. But I didn't want to be super didactic. And I was like, nah, that's not me. That's not the way that I work. There has to be a little bit of research that goes behind it and a little bit that stays behind the veil. But I think the goal is to continue to find different ways to render the materials out of new stuff. So it's not always the same. Because when we see columns, they might be concrete, they might be plaster, they might be marble, they might be brick. So I thought, why can't mine work the same way, but instead of it just being very generic as marble, can it be hair or clothing or these other things that are always attached to labor, but typically not given the same level of attention as some of the more larger tectonic stuff.
Very self-conscious we're not sitting on these throne chairs, but Megan, I wonder if you have your next question?
Yeah, I just want to also say thank you to the jury, to Ken and Sarah and Germane. This has been an incredible, joy-filled process being a part of this, and I'm really honored to have been be able to get to know this group and work with them on this cycle of the Wheelwright. My question for you is about design, research, and practice, the relationship between those two things, and how you might specifically start to name moments where findings and the work of your research over the Wheelwright forms a kind of abundance that would spill over, in your view, in practice, right? So what's so exciting is that I think there's so many different opportunities for that. So sort of what comes next from this work, could you cite for us, a few things that I found so incredible? Are the idea that identity could be explored and maybe leap to a different device or common element in the built environment to expand a kind of lexicon of options from the column to applying the same method of rule analysis and then breaking those rules, but things outside of a column. I think that there's opportunity for that method to make a leap. Likewise, I think things like the means of fabrication that you employed for this work, combining hand labor with the VR goggles, which was an absolutely incredible moment that you shared with us last night in the creation of one of your columns. And even material sensitivity about poplar, right? I mean, I think these types of things can make a leap into practice, and I'm just curious about how you might locate where the abundance of this work would spill over to what comes next for you.
So I never actually saw myself as someone that was super interested in materials. Much earlier in my career, I was always more so just interested in how do I get the necessary things to the people that need them with architecture. It's like, all right, you told me you need this park, that's design a park. You said you need this place for a baby shower, let's turn this old roofing company into a gallery flexible space. But I was very, very not concerned with materials, because oftentimes we had shoestring budgets, and you don't really get to worry about materials when you just don't have enough money to do that. This process has allowed me to be more entrenched into materiality. And that's why I've been so particular about what the columns have been made out of and how they've been constructed, because now I see I see the benefits and I see the beauty in when you have that level of detail into the project that I didn't get to see before, because we just didn't have budgets that were big enough. So now when I think forward, how we might project this and how the identity or labor or migration columns or even the design process can find themselves into built form. I was talking with Mark about this last night. It might be in the form of a pilaster that might come into a room, or it might just be, instead of thinking through typical flooring materials, luxury vinyl, or typical like pulverized wood that makes MDF or something, could it be hair instead, or could it be marble, or could it be stone? What is next, right? Everybody right now is looking at wood and CLT and things of that nature. What might be the next step beyond that as a way of material testing? The difficult part is architecture's number one thing is how do we mitigate risk? And every client wants to make sure that whatever they design allows them to not take on any type of risk. And as you can see in the work that I do, it's full of risk because we don't know if it's going to work or if it doesn't. But I like that level of experimentation. So part of my thinking is the next few steps will be self-funded explorations until I find somebody that's brave enough to allow me to do the real scale version of it, because they're not worried about the risk that might come as a part of that. I think I might have that opportunity in Memphis with a client who seems super interested in not worrying about risk, because we're about the same age, or amazing organization called Tone. And they're super into a lot of this. So a lot of the porch work we've brought into that form. A lot of the crown stuff we brought into that form as well. And their response was, we love it, we'll just go raise more money. So in that way, I think that makes it amazing for us to be able to do that. But I'm also trying to be cognizant of, I still would rather you keep that money for the financial sustainability of the nonprofit than as far as the tectonics of the building, which I know is opposite of what an architect is supposed to say. But I don't know how to turn that part of my brain off.
I'm excited for you to get out of a gallery space and for those forms of tactile interaction that might, involve new materials brought into the built environment or actually get to be interacted with.
And I can stop getting in trouble with curators.
That's right.
Who say, stop telling people they
no
can
more
touch
beeper
this
alarms
stuff.
added to your columns in a space, for example. Right. I think that's really, it's a wonderful vein yet to come for you from this work.
Which is happening right now in the projects, and with plenty of projects coming up in Dallas and many other places. But I'll leave it for David Hart to ask a nasty question and be critical to Germane.
You know me so well, Mark. Well, first of all, I want to, again, say thank you for being involved in this selection process and to be up here and talking to people that are part of the GSD architectural community. As somebody who's an outsider, not an architect, I actually really, what you said about how you define yourself in terms of your title is also about, I think, establishing critical distance, right? So the reluctance to identify with certain positions is an important one in terms of defining a kind of autonomy to find one's own path or to be able to speak critically to histories within which perhaps you don't feel that you have the capacity to either participate in or question the legacy of. And so that's something that I'm grateful for in terms of being here and part of this conversation, and which I definitely identify with your kind of, how you position yourself. I took the trouble of writing down a question, and it stems from an essay that I wrote on James Barner, who's a Ghanaian photographer, and he had a wonderful retrospective at the Serpentine in London a few years ago, and I wrote an essay for the catalog. And one of the things that I think is interesting is actually the cosmopolitan nature of the people who make up the committee itself, not only in terms of cultural and racial backgrounds, but also in terms of a pretty complex understanding of identity. And I think that my question really kind of stems with kind of breaking that open and trying to understand a kind of discomfort I have when one talks about Black identity. And so the question, is the Black cosmopolitan. Another way of considering diasporic movement as a system of asymmetric exchange. History doesn't stop, even though the flow of narrative implies a sort of relay race of continuity, where one significant event follows one baton pass after another in a linear flow, even if this involves massive shifts in geography and time. This is how we arrive at the evolution of orders. What happens if we stay in one place and follow it through its perhaps less illustrious moments that are still nonetheless significant, in that people still exist in that place and time, even though no one is paying attention? In the year 1960, 17 countries in Africa alone were established as sovereign nations and admitted en masse into the United Nations, which declared it the Year of Africa. In 1961, many of these countries joined the non-aligned movement, in part to ensure their independence and sovereignty in a world of rapidly changing geopolitics. Many of these countries required foreign capital and technical knowledge to begin the process of nation building. Bilateral development treaties were being made that included investments in large-scale infrastructure projects like dams, airports, and communication networks. Foreign advisors and specialists were invited, but more importantly, in an attempt to develop the elites who would build and run an emerging nation, scholarship opportunities were created for students to attend universities and technical colleges in both the West and the Soviet bloc. This diaspora of young Africans established a porous new structure, a generation of men and women finding themselves in new, unfamiliar surroundings. The effects of their temporary diaspora are far-reaching, layered, and complex, and it's important to emphasize the history of their experience abroad is now entangled in the identity of both their former host countries as well as the countries they return to. And so the question is, how does the plot change if you begin to recognize the dynamics of another system of Black diaspora, not rooted in the dominant narrative of slavery or even of colonialism, but rather instead examining other flows of people and knowledge, but also the stasis of non-historical events? Coptic architecture is perhaps an example of this slow, chaotic assimilation of cultural influences. How do these ideas inform the orders of identity, labor, and migration when concepts of race and culture become entangled?
Okay, that's beautiful writing. So we know why you got tenure. That's kind of how that works. No, I think you're really onto something there. I guess to put it in more direct terms, I am super fascinated by the periphery and the non-super robust opportunities of where Blackness shows itself that everybody latches onto. Like I'm super excited about those that happen outside when nobody's paying attention, nobody's watching, and can just happen in an everyday process that would otherwise go unnoticed. I jokingly always tell people that my practice can be summed up as if you know, you know. because I'm not going to explain stuff from there. And I think that's a perfect example of that. And so when I think of migration, identity, and labor, right now it was generated through my time in Italy as a way of understanding those specific spaces and understanding how people move through and the longer trajectory of the transatlantic slave trade and things of that nature. But it is an amazing opportunity to now look on the boundaries and see how I can interpret those as well in those other locations, and how even if the world never sees those, they still exist. And they're still just as important as the things that the world does see, because I think that's the part that becomes a bit blurry for people, and that if it's not the mainstream struggle, that it doesn't exist. And when you and I chatted last night, you said this one line that just stuck in my head for the rest of the evening, where you're like, why can't I just start from here? Why do I have to always go back there and start from this other place and take the baton and run? Like, why can't I just go from this point and then move forward? And then you jokingly said, if anybody wants to have a battle of who started with the most trauma, you're like, I'll probably win. But that still doesn't mean I need to start from that position. And so I've tried as much as possible to not start from that position. But I think part of, and I could be wrong, but I think part of my responsibility with this platform is to also still highlight the other people that went through that didn't get the same platform that I have. And I think that's what was so, to me, incredible about the MoMA show that we were in together, was that as the youngest participant in that show, I was like, there's hundreds and thousands of Black architects that came before me that were not selected. So now, how do I also pay homage to them? Because I need them to understand that I just got lucky and got the email. This doesn't mean there's anything special about me compared to the things that you've contributed to the field as well. And I'm always aware of that, right? Like, I'm super impatient. I don't believe in waiting your turn, that whole thing about you got time, you got time, you got time. No, I don't have time. Like, this is my time right now. I'm going to make room. If you open the door, I'm pushing it all the way open. It's your fault for letting me get my fingertips in. So in that way, I'm always trying to push that forward, but I also don't want to forget that I didn't get here on my own. There's a lot of people who didn't get the same opportunities that I've had. And so I want to make sure I speak to them as well. So I feel like all these things are entangled with each other. And I think that's literally what it means to be Black, is that there is no singular thread through this whole thing. So much of this is trying to figure out when to push and pull and yank and pull back and reveal and then conceal. What do you commodify? What do you keep internal? What do you only do as oral history? What do you actually write so that it's permanent? There's all these different layers that I struggle with on a regular basis that I'm trying to figure out.
I have a follow-up, and it's, we were both given the same brief for the MoMA show, which, had to do with concepts of Black space. And for me, it was a really problematic kind of thesis, in as much as all space is contaminated by all those who inhabit it. So I look out into an audience and I see multiple cultural positions being represented. And so the space is always kind of resistant to that kind of singular definition of an identity. And I was wondering, how do you navigate those kind of particularities or inconsistencies or blurs?
Oh man, I love the blurry. I live in Miami. There's nothing more blurry than Miami when it comes to that, man. I mean, when I first moved there, the question I would always get is, where are you from? And I'd be like, Chicago. Like, no, like, where's your family from? The west side of Chicago. And they're like, no, like, I'm trying to position you, because there, you could be Bahamian, I could be Haitian, you could be Cuban, you could be Peruvian, and that blurriness makes Miami so dynamic. But in the same way, it makes it so contentious, because people like to pretend that these different hierarchies don't exist, and they do. So how do we de-stratify the hierarchy so that everybody has that same entry point, and then what you do with it, that's up to you from there. So for me, I live in the blurry, I embrace the blurry, in hopes that now we all get the same opportunity, because we all have the same obstructive view. Those that don't live in the blurry and they get like the perfect transparency, I'm gonna be honest with you, I just don't find you that interesting, because it's like, if you have perfect sight, then you should be good. Or if you have a lot of money for your budget, it better be well designed. Like, show me what you can do with one hand tied behind your back. Show me what you can do when all of the pieces don't fit well together. And sure, that's not fair to certain people, but I just feel like I've seen so many clever communities pull off incredible feats with just the tactile things that they were given. And I've seen other communities that have everything at their fingertips still not be able to figure it out, So I'm like, that sounds like a you problem, not a me problem.
I have more of a reflection than a question. I kept on thinking about 2 years ago when we were all convening, over Zoom, reviewing Germaine's proposal. Also reflecting on last night, like 2 years later, what do we see? And I remember for myself, 2 years ago, one thing that really struck me about Germaine's proposal was the title, Anatomical Transformation in Architecture. Not only was it about something that is within a certain canon, you kind of have a sense of what he would do with the canon. Is he adding on to the canon? Is trying to dismantle the canon? But in his proposal, he was very clear, deliberate in terms of situating his work with that. And then last night, he unveiled the true title, Where This Flower Blooms. I'm very interested in that space between anatomical transformation architecture and Where This Flower Blooms. Because when I also hear, I think all of us here are teacher practitioners in some way, singer-songwriters, so oftentimes we have this kind of songwriter mentality. Sometimes we have the singer mentality, which I think is fundamentally different. Like Germaine said, you know it when you know it. It's very different from a songwriter mentality, a teacher mentality, when you have to engage in research, when you engage in a larger audience. That's why I kind of interpreted Sarah's question yesterday. Like, how is it repeatable? For me, is like, is that work, how does it situate back into a larger story? Because oftentimes, not just Germaine, I think all of us sometimes refer back to a more personal construct or allegorical construct. And I think it was great because it's very authentic. You talk about your upbringing, your ancestry, your family, your sisters, that was very relatable and very immediate. There's a dimension about that. And on the other hand, I always think back, one of the things that provoked me 2 years ago was also this incredible ambition of designing a black column. Even when we showed that 5 columns and then that cross, I'm just thinking, what did I put there? Is it the identity column, or is it the, and then yesterday you also showed those 18, 19 points of what are the tenets of a classical column. And for me, you are trying to dismantle that, So I think it will be, certainly this is not a 1 year, 2 year project. I know, for many of you, it's a lifelong project. I do like to see eventually as the columns develop in the same way that you develop your porches, develop your chairs, how do you often situate back into the argument that you have established? Even the picture of the Colosseum and the St. Peter's, yesterday when I saw that, a quick drawing with the identity column in front of Howard University, I want to put it back there and measure up against that. I think for me, it is like a lifelong project. And I think I hope this continues to grow, as you said, the more opportunities. I would love to see how that the pilaster, before it becomes a column, measures up against that Tunisian wall. When the turn of the stone already lays the foundation. I think this oscillation between a very personal construct and a maybe more universal construct really distinguishes you, as a singer-songwriter.
So I jokingly said last night that part of the reason why I came up with the name Anatomical Transformations in Classical Architecture, because I felt like that's what wins these types of awards. And then when I saw the other finalists, I was like, I'm so glad I picked this title. Because other people, I was like, I don't even know what these people are doing. I was like, I don't understand what this means. Because so much of it is like this certain terminology that we have to use as architects. And I was like, if I name this when I actually want to name this, they're not going to take this application serious. Because I've been on the other side as an adjudicator, and I see how fast people just dismiss applications in their first glance without actually reading through the entire proposal. It's like they didn't even give it a chance. So I was like, I'm not going to do myself that disservice considering what it goes to, but I also know what I'm trying to get out of it. So regardless of how I name this thing, if that's what it takes them to open the dossier, then they'll see what I'm trying to do after they get past that first title. So then when it came time to label this, and we're doing the email chain, I was like, I know they're going to think I'm going to name this the Wheelwright thing. I'm like, and I'm not at all, because I don't talk that way. I was like, but I'll put it at the bottom so they remember that's actually what they gave me money for, so that they don't forget that's what it was. Bless you. So instead, I'm going to call it what I really want to call it, which is like Where This Flower Blooms, and how we move through these spaces with a lack of representation, with a lack of identity, but you still push through in the end. And that was basically the story of me studying architecture. It's like always missing things, but still pushing through and finding some sort of way to get to the other side. I hope that this continues to get refined. I hope that it continues to become something that I can push forward. And I say hope in a way because I never know if tomorrow's promised. But that is my goal, to continue to push and experiment and use different materials and different scales and see what happens in that regard, because I think I have something that's pretty interesting, at least to me. And then that's how I continue to do that forward. So I really do thank y'all for picking me as the winner. 2021 was an incredible year in that I won some pretty big awards during that time. And so I jokingly said I'm going to ask you all some questions too. And I actually do have a general question to ask you all. And I also wrote it down so that I wouldn't forget it. God bless you. You got one more sneeze, the third sneeze. We're gonna put a mask on you. You know, we gotta make sure you're not getting us sick. Okay, so here's the question. I actually have two. They're both general questions to everyone. And David, it is not, why did you pick me? So you don't have to worry about that. That is not the question. These questions are more so general to maybe other people who might also want to apply for the Wheelwright in the future. And so just trying to figure out ways to pay it forward. All right, so here's my first question. And any of you can answer, all of you can answer it. All of your practices have a deep commitment to research as a generator of design and artistic practice. And the Wheelwright is obviously a research prize. How much does one's practice influence the success of their proposal? And how much does one's practice can be buttressed by this research also make them a more desirable candidate?
Is there a follow-up question, or that's the first
That's
one?
the first one.
That's the first one.
Dun, dun, dun.
I think Ken has to answer the question.
Ken has. Yeah, we can ask the meta question of how we became the jury members to begin. I'm not going to get it. My response, I think, because I don't formally say that I have any kind of practice, or I think in making the Available City now a nonprofit, that's the closest thing I am coming to a form of practice. And I think it's a nonprofit because I think it makes sense relative to the scale of the question I'm trying to ask. But I think, to me, I think wanting to be able to, that the research wouldn't just be, I think the ability for the person to develop the research and take it to some type of I'll say landing point. I don't want to say conclusion, where you feel like they would then be able that's something that maybe they would have gained knowledge from it, and then they might subsequently do other work where they can gain knowledge from it. So, but I think, to me, as somebody who has really not necessarily formally thought about practice, it wasn't necessarily how does it become a kind of architectural thing, strictly architectural thing, but that somehow they're producing the research and able to organize that research in a way where it's beneficial to them and I think beneficial to others.
I can answer it, perhaps not coming from the field of architecture, but I do participate in juries in the field of art, and we actually grant research travel grants at Penn in our department for our students. And I think what's interesting for me is this kind of occasional disconnect between, and to use kind of term that you brought to the foreground, between practice and labor, and what kind of is labor, right? And so kind of recognizing and honoring research as a form of labor that is essential within practice, and how we identify research, whether it is, as you said in your lecture, going to the library and looking at books, or walking around a town and taking pictures and just being observant. one of the things that's critical in terms of why we decided to provide these travel grants is to recognize the labor of going out into the world, to engage with the world, to use the process of heuristics in terms of experiencing, different methods and conclusions and structures and contexts. So that's a deeply important aspect of labor that feeds into whatever it is you're going to produce through your practice. And for me, that was one of the things that I thought was essential in terms of the Wheelwright Prize, was giving resources to a young architect to go out into the world and to experience things beyond what they would normally experience within the safety of their studio.
I think just to add to that, the capacity to have such a strong, you have such a strong proposal, title aside. It was a wonderful conversation that I had my screen on for. You just covered me up with your proposal presentation. It was such a strong project. I think your practice and your work samples were evidence that you would be able to take the knowledge gained from that and socialize it with a broader audience, which feeds back to the proposal in the first place, but also connects so directly to things you mentioned last night about the oscillation between a desire to work individually and then find moments to plug in to a broader community, and the way that you approach architecture as always encouraging interaction, right? So that was a slam dunk, self-selecting in many ways because of the strength of the proposal and your capacity to socialize what you would take from that through a design act that would encourage forms of interaction with that knowledge with a broader audience. Yeah.
I can't speak to the general agenda and very articulate strategy of the Wheelwright Prize as it's been evolving, which I think is something that we all admire and can aspire to. But I think if I think about my position on the jury and your work, I'm going to go back to what I opened with, which is what do we want to see in the future of architecture? And I think there is a lot of responsibility. I've certainly felt a lot of responsibility as a jury member because it is in architectural, as far as architectural prizes go at least, it's a substantial amount of funding that you're giving to a person, and also a substantial platform. And I think that deserves to be honored. I think actually the way that we structure prizes, I'm quite critical of in general. And I know that, we often have to evidence work samples and so on, but I taught in Johannesburg for almost 10 years, and I'm from that city. And I think that sometimes somebody can demonstrate what they can do at a certain scale, and it's the responsibility of a jury member to be able to recognize that and see vision in that, and then take a chance on that to allow that to grow. I think when the Serpentine awarded me the Serpentine Pavilion, I had never had a completed built project at that time. That became my first built project, and it was a competition submission, and I had to make an entry and so on. But those people really believed in that idea beyond believing in my portfolio. And I was talking about this morning in a meeting I had with a colleague who is faculty here, Hamid Bukhamsin, and who I have a lot of respect for. And we were talking about being a young person of color, in operating in several different practice contexts, often in the Gulf, where we see a lot of work and vision being imported from outside, and also where that work is not necessarily fitting or embodying or of the context and of the knowledge of the place. And when that is questioned, and I've been in the room several times and on juries where that is questioned, the response is always, oh, well, these architects have a portfolio to stand behind them. And my response to that is, how are all the young black and brown people and all the people who don't have a voice and will never get an opportunity, how are they going to have a platform if we're not giving them a platform? because clients out in the world are saying exactly the same thing. And how do we get clients? Clients are a network of wealthy people who need to trust someone with all of their money, huge amounts of money, to be able to realize a project. So I think we have to be able to invest in vision. And you did, of course, have evidence of incredible work. But what I also saw in there was sparks of things that can make huge contributions to both the profession and canon. Does that make sense? And I think that that's something that we all have to continuously advocate for. We can't only evidence work that's already there. We have to take the responsibility of having the vision to advocate for work that is going to come.
No, I think that's, it actually leads to my second question. And it's great that the conversation is going this way. The second question was literally, when reviewing applicants for the Wheelwright, how much of an applicant's prior work is prioritized versus the potential of their project? And so you're literally starting with that. So if you would like to expand on it beyond just the Wheelwright, or if others also have ideas in that same vein, I think that is important, because as someone that's adjudicated as well, you have to be able to see someone that's only ever worked in, say, textiles, and project how they might create a large-scale public sculpture out of something else.
Yeah.
And how do you find credibility in that?
Yeah.
Is it a reference letter? Is it you putting yourself into their shoes? And then what happens if they don't follow through, if they get the platform and then it doesn't go well? Do they get the second chance? Because that's always the catch. It's like certain people get second chances and certain people don't.
Well, again, I can only, I'm just speaking here from personal response. But I think, and I also worked on a Biennale that opened last year, as was mentioned. For me, that was so much about working with young emerging voices or people who didn't have a platform to practice at scale. In many instances, of course, we had some really established names as well, but that was about taking a chance and providing an infrastructure. And in that context, really kudos to the Diria Biennale Foundation on that front, because there was a lot of production support provided, and artists didn't have to fundraise for the projects by themselves or anything like that. So it was able to give an opportunity to people to work at scale. And I have at least seen from those artists' works that so many of them were picked up by galleries. Many of those architects are now working on really large-scale public commissions. And to my knowledge, on the whole, I think that because of the way our industry works, we don't prioritize names like that or faces like that. And I think everybody thinks that they do. But in the industry, we really don't. And that's why I'm really an advocate for platforms like pavilions and biennales and research prizes, because I think it's an opportunity to be able to invest in something. I also think that sometimes it absolutely doesn't work out. But that's the same goes for everything. And the strength of that is the people who are at the helm, the people who are guiding the process, and the people who are involved. And one has to put trust in that. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But it might have worked out 9 other times out of the 10.
It's interesting. I mean, perhaps just to reframe the question, into kind of sphere that I operate in more regularly, which is curatorial work. And to speak briefly of systemic racism, I always kind of liken it to a virus, in as much as a virus has a singular mission, which is to reproduce itself, right? And that's the way that systemic racism kind of proceeds, is that it's not concerned with, mutation. It's not concerned with, changing. It's concerned only with a kind of aggressive drive to reproduce the conditions that would maintain, an idea of the status quo. And so part of what I try and do in the mode of curator is to identify a position outside of my own that's completely and thoroughly foreign to one that I would normally occupy, to ideas or concepts that I can already imagine a set of outcomes. And so simply by creating space for, that thing that is outside of oneself, one interrupts the flow of reproduction and allows for something new to emerge. And I think that in that way, that was, I think, part of the spirit of looking at and judging, the prize was, how do we acknowledge and promote ideas that, I love what you said about kind of imagining the future. Yeah, the future has to include these ideas that are outside of oneself. It has to create opportunities for this possibility of change and mutation. And that's the only way that we can overcome certain boundaries that are so kind of institutionalized that we don't even know that they're there anymore.
Just wanted to make a quick clarification. I used black and brown bodies and ideas as an example, but what I'm really talking about is ideas that are coming from places of difference, regardless of who they're coming from, and that are not yet perhaps fully articulated or articulable in the canon, but really deserve to be because they're asking important questions.
I think, for me, I think Germaine's question really touches on this difference between academia and practice, this complicated relationship, especially for those who inhabit both worlds. I thought of Oscar Wilde, who said, there are artists who ask questions, there are artists who give answers. What you cannot have is an artist who answers his or her own questions. And we're oftentimes trapped in this moment where we formulate the question and we have to provide the answer. So I would put it dumbly, if research and scholarship is asking the question, the work is the answer. So oftentimes in our role is do the answer also situate back into that question that we have forwarded. I thought of Adolf Loos's definition of an architect being a bricklayer who studied Latin. And for me, if I translate that back into curricular terms, it would be the mastery of bricklaying as a prerequisite for an introductory course in a Romantic language. So as opposed to, let's say, a Latin scholar who laid a few bricks. And I think in the practice world is always your work is a platform to have a voice, but in the academic world it's always your voice as a platform for work. I'm putting it very simplistically, but I think about the role of the work plays within a prize like the Wheelwright, and at the end I feel we are in an academic institution. So Megan and I have served in a field jury, so you can disagree with me, but I feel at the end. Within this Wheelwright context, it's really the proposal that matters more. The work is a bit more of a tiebreaker, Like you don't want the work to drag it down, at least for me, or the work substantiated, but it's really the hope that the research will be a platform to generate or enhance your work in the future.
I'm not going to refute that. I agree with that. I think perhaps it's also about like a vision for the future, which Sumaya has, wonderfully captured in forms of architectural production too. So work samples, the research pushing things, right, very clearly with an agenda asking new questions. But I think also there's promise in the work that's shared to encompass a wider range of artifacts of architectural production. And your work, I think, was astounding in that way that you shared with us. But there's a certain sort of clarity to the research proposal that I think motivates the opportunity to find new questions through the research, not simply answer the question posed, which is something I really appreciate. Like your problem seeking through the research, not solving it through one output of work. It's something I really appreciate in the title change because you went somewhere with it, right? You allowed yourself to take a tangent and dig into things that may not have totally aligned. We're not back at the porch and portico. We're in a different space, and I think your work through modes of producing and output actually brought up new questions that you were able to mine and that set the stage for what will come next. So the research proposal was so strong, but I think for you in particular, the work you shared offered that promise of a wider array of forms of production in the world that affect our thinking about the built environment in meaningful ways. Yeah. And your own.
Yeah, and I don't know that I would add so much than what's been said, but I do think I don't think it has to be that the work is necessarily polished, like the work that might be in the portfolio, but somehow it does begin to show the kind of promise, and it's maybe through the promise that maybe even that the question asked, it wasn't necessarily directly answered, but what that question began to spawn. And so I think to begin to see something, so we can begin to project similarly about the new question that's being asked. So.
Those are my two questions.
So, if the time machine has been invented and we could jump into one, would we still have given Germane the prize?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
You can,
He just
abstain, Samara.
Oh my God, of course. It's not abstaining. I thought that was self-evident, and I didn't have to say that.
I think he just admitted that he jumped back in time and put it in our head to say yes.
Well, let's see if we can take some questions from the audience or any comments or reflections. Huh? Oh, please, yes. Do we? Oh, thanks.
Thank you again for the presentation. I loved the discussion yesterday. I loved it today too. So like I said yesterday, I'm a design researcher. I find myself in many of what you talk about. And as a graduate student, even now, I struggled with deep ethical issues with the practice of design because I didn't see myself in it as a Tunisian. All the history of design they taught us was Eurocentric, and even architecture, art history, all of it. And even for a practice like, so I was torn between becoming a professional designer, produce something marketable to have a salary, and producing work that has a social impact, political impact in my home country or anything. Like, so something that questions the status quo. So design is intrinsically linked to capitalism, patriarchy, is both colonized and colonizer in a way. I like the way Onufawa defines design as a symbolic violence. So we're maybe not the engine of capitalism, we're maybe the turbocharger. Like we are into the commodifying machine of capitalism, and in a way we are deeply linked with the crisis of imagination that we're living now. I feel, in a way. So. How do you define your, I like the way you define your work as an architecture anthropologist, and like you said, if you know, you know. So there is stuff I know, I practice on a daily basis, even in my research, in my work as a designer. But then, how can you have the money if it's not grants, prices? How can you create a economical model that both produces a marketable work, design work, and a real impact that is not into humanitarian design or pity or such discourses? That's my question.
Okay, so I think two things. First, I have a terrible business model. Okay? I want to start with that.
Me too.
My terrible business model is based off the fact that I actually pay people what they're worth, which does not actually make you money when you own a business, right? It's like, how can we marginalize these things? Whereas I'm like, nah, this is what you're worth. This is what we're going to give you. So this is how that. So not a good business model. People tell me this all the time. It's like, you pay him that much? Like, yeah, isn't that the way it's supposed to work? Apparently not. So don't take business advice from me. The second thing, though, and I think for me this is the more important part, and I'm going to blame academia for this. There's a glamorization of community or socially engaged architecture. I started doing this stuff in 2009, right after I graduated from undergrad and moved to South Africa. And it wasn't glamorized. It was just, you have to do things because people need shelter, right? And then we hit this moment, I want to say like after 2020 and the Floyd protests, that people just started popping up with all these courses about how to use design for justice or design for good. And it's like, I've never seen you do this ever in your entire life, but now you're an expert on the thing. So when I say there's a glamorization, I think in that way, people are putting it on a pedestal. So when you ask very bluntly, how do you do this work in your own daily life and make sure maybe it's not humanitarian in that way, I think if you're providing basic necessities for communities that need it, whether it's celebrated or not, like, you do the work. And if somebody finds it, awesome, but you have to be willing to understand that nobody may ever find out about it. And so I always go back to, there's this, you guys know like the shopping cart like story, where it's like if you see a shopping cart in the parking lot and you don't put the thing back, you're a bad person. But if you put it back, you're a good person. People are like, why does it matter? Because nobody saw you put back the shopping cart. Nobody watched you. You don't get a pat on the back for pushing the shopping cart back into the thing with everything else. But it's like, I just made somebody else's life just a little bit easier because now they don't have to pick up my mess. I'm doing this for a collective good as opposed to here's the thing that is required or not required of me. And are you okay with the fact that you're not going to get a pat on the back for putting the shopping cart back? A lot of people are not okay with that. A lot of people want the pat on the back. A lot of people want you to no, I want you to know I did this good thing. That's why on the internet you see every goddamn TikTok or Instagram story, person like, here's the good thing I did today. And it's like, why did you have your phone out? If you had your phone out, was it really like a true act of kindness or whatever you want to call it? So I think, again, it's just my personal opinion, because that's how I started my career the same way. If you want to do this work, then you just go do the work, because trust me, it's out there and there are community groups that need it. You have somebody like David Brown here who does a lot of work with communities, and they're always looking for people to help. But you might not be on the front page of a newspaper. You may not win a Wheelwright because of it. You may not win Architectural League Prize because of it. And are you okay with that?
Sure. But then there's a question of activism. So are you an activist or just a designer and architect? That's what I'm saying. So sometimes the market blocks you on doing that thing. Like what I'm saying is, I'm doing it. Okay. I just go and work with community in Oasis and we're doing stuff. But then how can you maintain that? And you asked it in the first question, like a terrible business model. That's what my question is. How can you provide for a living and continue do that without selling your soul to big corporations?
Oh, go for it.
I mean, I think I agree with your ethics. I disagree with your conclusions. Yeah. I mean, it's not a binary. It's not as though one makes a choice to do this or that, and that, the outcome is always a consequence of having to choose from one of those poles. I mean, wouldn't we want to have corporate headquarters designed by more ethically motivated architects? I mean, there are ways that one can participate within the continuum of design, operate ethically, but also have ambitions that affect different communities across the full spectrum of opportunity. And I don't, so I think one doesn't always have to kind of resort to activism in order to have a kind of, ethically pure conscience and still, practice design. I think that there are ways that we can participate across a whole host of opportunities where we can bring a degree of intelligence and insight and the uniqueness of the cultural positions that have informed our upbringing and begin to invest them in, the landscape of the built environment. This is why I mentioned Coptic architecture, as this incredible melange of influences that spans, empires across the globe. That you see, you see traces of the Byzantine, of Islamic architecture, of Christian, Roman, Greek, Egyptian. I mean, all of these things are present within that history of architecture in a particular place. History doesn't stop. We contribute. We travel. The fact that all of us here have very, very different cultural positions, and we all contribute in meaningful ways to design, is, I think, a demonstration of how far we've moved from concepts of a kind of purely Eurocentric concept of design. That, in my mind, doesn't exist, and it has never existed. It's always been contaminated by the influence and participation of people like us.
I think if you want to make a practice that is motivated by profit and success from the get-go, then that is kind of designing something at the outset in a particular way. But I do think that if one is led by purpose that comes from the work and that is not so easily definable or not so easy even to articulate yourself why you're interested in those things instinctively, but you're just following that, that is a very different kind of practice, and that builds a life of its own that you can never know, and as Germane said, may be noticed or may never be noticed. But I really, really genuinely believe that that is something that we should all be doing. It's something that I encourage my students always to at least think about first. And I understand that that's not the position that everyone can have, and it is also either a great privilege or a great sacrifice to operate from that place. But I think that asking about doing all the things simultaneously is very difficult. I don't think I'll ever get it right in my lifetime. and I think that I've also, I would love to, but I have accepted the fact that I chose to do it this way, and perhaps if I wanted to, I could design soulless things. Or not that I'm calling my work soulful by any means, but I could take on briefs that generate a certain amount of capital, let me say. And that's not that I think that I've seen time and time again so many artists who start in a particular place and then sell out to some kind of machine that involves money. And then it becomes so difficult to sustain that they have to keep going like that. And I think the hope is, as you're saying, that one can come back to their practice at some point and use that to fuel the practice. But I haven't seen many successful models of where that works out entirely. Oftentimes, the person can become, or the risk is that one becomes so trapped in that model that it's impossible to go back, because that then becomes the working model. And I think thinking deeply about what the working process is and what the working method is important, because it's so difficult to hold on to anyway on a daily basis. And selling out, it's once that happens, I think it's gone. At least for me personally, it will be gone. So I've had to, or I'm working to not give up every day and to resist in some way. And also to hold on to this very small, very quiet place that for me is rich with imagination, even if no one else can see it.
And I think one thing I would just add quickly is, since Germane was talking about, I really spend a lot of time with communities. But I think part of it is I really just spend a lot of time with communities in terms of if somebody's going to plant a sunflower field. So I go and I help plant sunflowers. And I'm not looking to do anything more than that. I'm just looking to getting to know them. And then at some point, they may be working on something, and you go, well, hey, I can bring some other point of view besides helping plant sunflowers. But it's not entering into I'm going there looking for work. I think it's more trying to think about, I am interested, they're doing some things that I'm interested in. How do I actually go there and participate and maybe learn something? And then potentially, I might be able to help out with something. Some of my work started when I first moved to Chicago. I still don't quite know why. They asked a group out in North Lawndale, the coordinator for the director of neighborhood housing services in North Lawndale. I think he set a strong example. He moved to North Lawndale. That he thought the way that he could be most effective about his work was to actually live there and learn about the community. He also really began to think about how do I, realizing that the neighborhood was depopulating, how do you really begin to bring people back? And so really said, well, we need to talk about what's significant about North Lawndale, and identified graystones as a structure that he thought was, that North Lawndale he thinks has the highest number of graystones, and so approached Chicago Architecture Center now about doing an exhibit. Somehow they decided to ask me. And I did an exhibit on North Lawndale, but in one of the first things I realized, we were looking at pictures, and I was like, well, we need pictures from the community because Chicago has a rich photo archive, but it really is a photo archive that's driven by neighborhood contributions. So I would just show up to things with a scanner, like a flatbed. You couldn't take photos. Flatbed, scanner, and computer, and ask people to bring photos just to make a photo archive. That's now part of one resident in North Lawndale is really running the historical society, but she has she has all the exhibit panels, which I had built in a way where they're steel, so they're heavy to move, but she has them all, and so everything's still in a good shape in terms of, and she's looking for a home for the work, but also has the photo archive, and so that's the contribution, is really helping there begin to be this other information plus. And I won't take credit for her work. She was working at Neighborhood Housing Services, and I think through the influence of Charles Leeks realized that her next thing was to start the Historical Society. So I think it's also just understanding those kind of rippling impacts that you can have too, and you may not know of all of them. And so I think that's really where the work, I think the willingness to do the work, the willingness to not necessarily have to take it to an end right away. And then I think to be able to look back and somewhat just see what else is happening, I think are just the things to do, or some of the things to do. That doesn't present a direct solution, but I think that's just how you begin to go about the work and how you start to see its implication over time.
Just a closing comment. When I served as the artistic director for the biennial, I had to raise a lot of money. I had to go out and raise a lot of money. I'm so sure Samaya and David also experienced that. Oftentimes you go to these foundations and then you present what your platform is. And then sometimes I would go and they said, hey, we already given a lot of money to stop gun violence and for Children's Hospital. What is your platform? Design? I'm almost even embarrassed to present. I think architecture and design is more often, especially in this context, overestimated than underestimated. And I think understanding what architecture can do or what design can do is or the limitations of what that is much more liberating than what it could promise it could do. So if you ask it to make money, give you a living, be an activist, and not say so to the corporation, it's not going to happen. That's what I'm hearing from that. I think I like Germane's analogy of pushing the supermarket cart back. Maybe it's a little bit more than that, but it's just really this kind of action, that in a way build up what design could be. And it will never be, like Germane said, be in the headlines. It will never change the world in many other things. If you want to change the world, I think to choose design is pretty mediocre. But if you're in design, think of what it can do best. And it's not something that happens immediately. It really happens over time. And I think an academic institution and a prize like the Wheelwright is really to support this type of work. I think Victor Lihotzky is the one who said that the avant-garde is always about moving what is on the periphery to the center. And I think we all see what Germane is doing is part of the effort. And so I'd like to congratulate you again, Germane.
Thank you.